Good evening. My name is Aska Hisa. I'm the Director of Learning and Engagement, and on behalf of all of us at ICALA, welcome. 5 days ago, we opened our main exhibition, Scientia Sexualis. Scientia Sexualis. Yeah. 5 days ago. 5 days ago, we celebrated an exhibition that was 5 years in the making. Scientia Sexualis is an ambitious group survey of contemporary artists whose works take up the fraught relationship between sex, gender, and science. The exhibition is co-curated by Jennifer Doyle, Professor of English, University of California, Riverside, and Jeanne Vaccaro, Assistant Professor of Transgender Studies and Museum Studies, University of Kansas, and they were joined with organizational support by Amanda Sroka, ICALA Senior Curator, and Caroline Ellen Liu, our former curatorial associate, who's here. Yeah, Caroline's normally in Italy, so she's here. It's amazing. This exhibition has 27 incredible artists. We already know that through their work, ICALA will be a great site for dialogue, revelation, and action. The show is realized as part of the ambitious collaboration across art institutions throughout Southern California known as PST, Art and Science Collide, led by the Getty. Scientia Sexualis is also wonderfully connected to our bookshelf residency with the independent publisher Gender Fail. There is a beautiful collaboration around the exhibition catalog between Gender Fail and the co-curators, which is this sexy book, that cover there, featuring the title font created by B. Oakley, founder of Gender Fail, who drew inspiration for the typeface from the historic protest banners of the Street Transvestites Action Revolutionaries, aka STAR. The catalog is an important document for this show and available for purchase. Right over there. We had over 600 visitors to our opening last Saturday and hope to have many more over the course of this exhibition, which will be on view through March 2nd, and as our public programs roll out. We have a lot of programs, and we hope you can catch as many as possible. Tonight's is the first, and it is very exciting. We've called it Psych Talk, as we have invited scholar, writer, educator, and editor Hannah Zeavin, whose work centers on the history of human sciences and the history of media technology. Zeavin's first book, The Distance Cure, A History of Teletherapy, is now out from MIT Press. Mother Media, Hot and Cool Parenting in the 20th Century, also from MIT Press, is expected to release in 2025. And Hannah is at work on their third book, All Freud's Children, A Story of Inheritance. So look out for that. In 2021, Zeavin co-founded the Psychosocial Foundation and is the founding editor of Parapraxis, a new magazine for psychoanalysis. Essays and criticism have appeared in Book Forum, Dissent, The Guardian, Harper's Magazine, N+1, The New York Review of Books, The New Yorker, and elsewhere. Zeavin is assistant professor in the Department of History at UC Berkeley. And joining Hannah in conversation are our fantastic Scientia Sexualis co-curators, Jeanne Vaccaro and Jennifer Doyle. We've created these bio sheets with their information. We like to think that these are program souvenirs. You can get it autographed by these fantastic people, or you can use it to take notes, prepare some questions for these fantastic people. Thank you for supporting ICALA by being here tonight.
Thank you, Aska and Alberto and the staff at ICALA for facilitating so much. I'll be thanking them a lot over the next few months. But this is the first of our programs, and we're really looking forward to working closely with the frontward-facing team here.
And maybe we'll just say something about the structure of what we're thinking. This is very much going to be a kind of open dialogue among the three of us, celebrating Hannah's work and her thinking and how important it has been, and also sharing some of the work in the exhibition that kind of threads through the themes of psychoanalysis, its histories, and its ongoing reverberations. And we'll also have a lot of time for Q&A. So we'll probably talk for a while, and then hopefully we'll talk all together for a while. So start thinking about your questions and your comments.
Okay, I'm gonna move the slideshow a little bit. Okay. Jeanne and I will be really just enjoying discovering our routine. I'm starting with an image of Freud's couch. This is a photograph from the Freud Museum in London. And the figure of, so I'm going to start with a slightly autobiographical thing, which is when I started graduate school in the really early 90s, like 91, I think. Psychoanalytic theory was one of my central preoccupations. I took a Freud seminar right away, Lacan seminars. I was all about psychoanalysis, and then it fell completely out of my scholarship when I left graduate school. I've only recently published an essay that would register as psychoanalytic criticism, and it was partly because I was having a lot of difficulty situating myself in the genealogy of thought that is anchored in these kind of men. And it's taken me this long to find my way back as a scholar, and this show is definitely part of that. I'm going to do the framing stuff about the show. Okay, one of the things that we were really wrestling with in this exhibition, and also with the call from the Getty to produce an exhibition around like the relationship of art and science, is the infamously sexist culture that clings to a wide range of disciplines that fall under the science kind of umbrella. Many of us in the room, I'm sure, have personal and difficult memories of maybe a math class or a physics class or a biology class where you either felt like completely alienated or isolated, depending on your position vis-a-vis race, gender, sexuality, or you sat in a class and you heard something about really you that you knew was wrong, right? Or that you feared might be true. And this show is very much a gathering of work by artists, mostly contemporary art, work made from 1990 forward, of people who were kind of sitting with those histories. And one of the things that we really struggled with was where we place these kind of father figures, like Freud, for example, in psychoanalysis. And as Jeanne and I were talking about the programming, we thought this would be a really great place to sort of start, with a thinker who's working in this space. And yes, I'm sorry, I don't have an elegant way to wrap up that sentence, so I'm going to hand the baton to my collaborator.
Well, let's, Hannah, I know you wanted to read something, if you still want to.
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to go back to that.
My phone might be faster. Let's see. So we were talking about just that question of, we can say fathers, it's not just contained to the men of the field of psychoanalysis. Yeah. But what we mean when we say daddy, or like the New York Times one says, not your daddy's Freud. Right, I made the joke, of course, not my mother's Freud, because my mother's an analyst, as is daddy. They both are, but one looms larger.
You didn't know that?
No, I didn't know that. What, you're...
Me too.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. We knew.
So there's like daddy lowercase, there's daddy uppercase. But there's here in the program, which you really should buy. It's so beautiful. I saw it on PDF, and like physically, it's another level. The two of you, right? This body of literature and laboratory practice presents itself as revealing the truth of our differences, but its most powerful social function has been, in Foucault's words, to render sex into an object of great suspicion. We trace this discourse in white supremacist paranoia about replacement and in anti-trans panic that casts trans people as threats to the nuclear family is one place. And then the next Foucault mention, is it true? 2 pages later? I'm gonna have to get the screenshot off my phone to not waste anyone's time. See, I am a millennial. I'm like, the book is right here, but it'll be faster this way. The emphasis on recovering and repairing, so like that's to say what's bad about it, right? Really bad, and the stakes are quite high. But on the other hand, and this is the central ambivalence of this show and also my work for sure, this emphasis on recovering and repairing historical misdeeds in the service of a less racist and misogynist present speaks to one of the central tensions of this show. And so I thought, we thought in the so-called green room, that we might talk about both really acknowledging the misdeeds, so-called, or I call them the errors, and then also that wish to quote-unquote repair or relearn, and we thought we might begin there.
Okay. There's so many places to start from. I don't know if this is the right one or not, if we should go to Schraber, who's deeper in this kind of slideshow. Sorry, I always put too much on these things. Sorry, I don't know what that was that I just did.
I mean, I guess many of you probably walked through the show by now and you've seen some of the work. Maybe you could pull up Leatella. You know, one of the things that I think that your work thinks through and this exhibition does, as well as a kind of the ambivalence around what we do sort of with the relics of these disciplines that have such a heavy history and such a heavy weight, whether it's psychoanalysis, psychiatry, anthropology, gynecology, that we very much live with today and that have kind of ongoing consequences for us. And this is a work by Joseph Leatella. It's a shibari-bound kind of self-portrait sculpture of the artist, weighing in at 126 pounds of used textbooks of the DSM. And, you know, this is a really generative work for a lot of reasons. He was 126 pounds when he made the work. He was thinking about kind of the relationship between constraint and liberation, the kind of BDSM nod to a pleasurable constraint, I guess. And so maybe that's a good place to think about sort of ambivalence and our relationship to holding, kind of thinking through, like an insistence on thinking through, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, so I'll react first personally. I came through this, I live in Oakland. I came down and saw this show today, and as I approached this artwork, of course, I thought it was the standard edition rather than the DSM. And
You mean the standard edition of Freud's writings?
Yeah,
Yeah.
which feature actually in several places in the show. You know, because I think we'll get there to the other child of psychiatry, the beautiful and strange image where it is another daddy as Freud and Freud as daddy. You know, one way yeah, there you go. That's my life. I texted my partner and I was like, "Is that my book cover?" You know, I think that this is the real political project of the work we do at the magazine Parapraxis, and I hope is the political work I try and do in all of my writing and teaching, is that on the one hand, we could just reject, you know, and I think that will remain a live question for me, I hope, for a really long time. It's an open question. Why to stay attached to something that hates you? Or it's also a question I have when I listen to Guns N' Roses, but at a much more serious level. Why do I love this thing that hates me? And then on the other hand, we've had, and I'm gonna go look at Rosie, who's in the audience, who's written a beautiful essay on Juliet Mitchell. We've had you know, incredible amount of generative work that is insistent on not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Maybe the dad, but not the baby. So Juliet Mitchell gives a really important and vital reframing, I think echoes throughout this show, about Sigmund Freud and the problem of their misogyny. You could sub in the question of Freud's homophobia. In Jennifer's new book, I brought all the books, a beautiful essay on paranoia that starts with that question about Freud and his homophobic readings. But Juliet Mitchell's point, right, can be summed up as, does Freud offer us, and you could sub in any of the daddies, I think, and they'll work better or less well. Does Freud offer us a description or a prescription? Is Freud telling us about the lived experience of misogyny? If we go back to the hysterics, we can think about the hysterics as on strike, or is he offering us a totally fucked, unredeemable sort of diagnosis of the hysteric? And I think that live tension, you can move it through different apertures, different essays. But from there, humans are just not that creative. We can recuperate or recover not just like a less misogynist Freud, but actually what Freud was up to.
Yeah.
And
Do you mind if I jump in here a little bit? Because I know there's some people here who are like actual analysts and some who are like academics who work in this zone, artists, and so. But one of the things that I wanted to like the stories about Freud I wanted to bring down into the room is that the origins of psychoanalysis are rooted in his in hysterics, right? In treating women who are being categorized as hysterics, and then surrounding that kind of origin story too, there's also the debate about whether or not the women who are coming in plagued by a wide range, all these forms of unease, existential unease, had also stories of sexual violation, and which would be recounted right in the therapeutic scene. And there's been different kinds of takes on that, some of which are like, there's this, some of which take those narratives at face value, and then others of which actually, see this as fantasy and the fantasy projection brought into the scene of analysis. So there's like this giant question that hovers over the origin story of psychoanalysis. Mm-hmm. I know that you've thought a lot about this, so I'm partly, kind of wanting to open up the space for talking about this question about sexual vulnerability and intimacy, and then this and therapy. Sorry.
yeah, I mean, for the origin story of psychoanalysis, I mean, I do want to say that again in Rosie Stockton's beautiful essay, I'm like, everyone give me your phone number, I'll text you the link. But Rosie supplied this beautiful archival photograph from, I was thinking about this when we were talking in the green room, of a second wave feminist using Freud's face as target practice, literally for darts. And one thing they're reacting to is exactly that, in this sort of second wave moment, is exactly that question of like, Freud's descriptions of these women are so full, they would argue, of the sort of misogynistic mores of his time and theirs and ours. Throw it out. But if so that's one approach. For me, the origin story of psychoanalysis comes from, Anna O, who's not, I would disagree with the idea that she's the first patient of psychoanalysis, but she's like the last patient not of psychoanalysis. She's not treated by Freud. There are always these historical errors in the way these things get remembered. She's treated by Freud's mentor, and he, instead of treating her the way she would have been treated, if you want to go back to the Charcot slide, where the fainting woman here is made into a kind of specimen. I'm thinking of Emily Wells, who is an LA writer. Recent book, Matter of Appearance, about this image in part. She instead is listened to, and many other things, right? She's also drugged. She's also unable to get out of bed. But Boyer listens morning and then again at night and 6 days a week. I mean, this kind of house call is unheard of. And that's the innovation, is simply to listen. And I do think that psychoanalysis continues to provide us a science of listening that is, unfortunately not purchasable by the vast majority of people, not accessible. But that's a historical construction. It's a priori. And so I think that's the place from which to start. Like, are people worth listening to? Are there complaints worth listening to hermeneutically? And I think that's what psychoanalysis gives us, really for the first time in the West, right? A science of listening like that.
A footnote, Felix Guattari described professors as the exact opposite of therapists because we do all the talking.
Well, especially if you're of French lecturing, right?
Do you want to show Sandra's image?
Yes.
So I'm just thinking about what you said about kind of a science of listening, and a move into a science from a kind of religion. And
these were amazing,
aren't they? So this is from the video, and then this is from Sandra Ibarra's menstrual Rorschach test. This is the only actual blood in the exhibition, which seemed funny because, of course, menstrual blood has been taken up as a kind of like feminist artistic trope. Sandra Ibarra is a Bay Area-based artist who also has a very deep activist practice that's rooted in abolition and decriminalizing sex work. And this is a series of prints that she made and sold on Etsy for like $20. And when she sold them, part of the practice was to ask if the person who bought it wanted to give her an interpretation of what, to engage in the thing. And she then made a film. This is a still from it. It's her speaking in Spanish with subtitles, so she's also kind of thinking about the racism of psychoanalysis as a science, the kind of like haunting specter of race over the discipline. And anyway, I was thinking about this in terms of what is a science of listening and what are the kind of interpretive kind of fields and pathways that kind of crack open, because many of the artists, whether it's Liatella's DSM sculpture or Ala Palomar's Schreiber as a Woman cinematic installation, there are all these kind of places where the armature of the interpretive field is kind of pushed against, and this like edging around it, like a use of it, but also an edging toward another possibility.
Absolutely. So what happens when you start to listen is another question. And that's been the major political debacle and remaining sort of the question of, okay, so then do we keep doing it, of psychoanalysis. So psychoanalysis, the way it is in the US, and all of our kind of negative transferences, whether they're correct or not, to psychoanalysis, the person who does exactly no talking, so no interpretation, on the one hand, the kind of Upper East Side psychoanalyst of the New Yorker cartoon is one thing. That doesn't map with so much of psychoanalysis in the rest of the world where it lives. Freud he would call it a colonial impulse for psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis, wrapped the globe very quickly, sometimes against Freud's wishes, sometimes in line with them. And so the question is not just like how we listen or what the metrics are, whether it's a neutral listening, one devoid of markers, the idea we should only take up what's inside when the rest of the world is outside. That's how class and race tend to be figured in American psychoanalysis, whereas gender and sexuality are all too much in the frame, right? It's like psychoanalysis has these deep biases, and so puts class and race on the outside, out there in the world, not on the inside. That's endemic to US mainstream psychoanalysis. Who we listen to, the kind of purchasing of the time and walking in. We're accumulating all the reasons not to redeem the science, I realize. Maybe my ambivalence is torqued today. But I think that's one of the major problems, is can you make another kind of clinical practice with everything stacked against you?
I think maybe we can talk a little about your book, The Distance Cure, because I think one of the kind of central themes of that book is that the dyad of the patient and the therapist, and we could insert other kind of forms of patient and doctor, is never kind of a straight chain. There's always an external kind of force, and that's like what's mediating the experience. And that could be like culture at large, these kinds of things that you're talking about in terms of like systems of power and structure, but it gets broken in all kinds of ways. And in this like image, so this is a self-portrait by the painter Nicole Eisenman. Her father was a psychiatrist, so even though it's a Freud-like figure, and she's there's all the kind of like trappings that are written about beautifully in the catalog of like the flaccid daisy and the penis vase, and you see the DSM up in that corner along with like Spinoza and Heidegger. But she's in this image, in this painting, she's looking away and he's looking over her, and that was the style, the kind of orthodox style of analysis. There wasn't a kind of like face to face, and part of what I think your book reckons with is the kind of relational fracturing that happens when people make contact through like radio call-in shows, and just the kind of like democratizing and populating of that field with all different kinds of figures. And maybe we can just show Now's Couch too, because this is another really interesting work in the exhibition, which is part of a much larger series that Now Bustamante actually has on view at Track 16 here in Los Angeles. But this is a couch that is kind of elevated like this. And there's a video of Now speaking to leading you through the vaginal imaginary. And it does, it's really incredible. It's like crystals and stalagmites. And so there you have the kind of the healer is looking at the, patient, because you lay on the couch, you're invited to lay on it. And then, you look at your healer. It's this very like direct closed circuit that happens in that installation. So I kind of think like juxtaposing the Eisenman and the two eyes looking in the same, pair of eyes looking in the same direction, not making contact, and then this work where there is like a form of contact. It's like a really nice play.
Although, if you go back to the other, my instinct, first I was like, can I really lie down? That was so exciting. My friend Carlin was with me. I was like, for real. But my instinct, because the head is elevated and because I'm an analytic subject and interpolated or whatever, was to lie the other way. But I lay as I should. But because, right, that's where the chaise longue goes the other way, where your head would be elevated instead of having your feet up, which is very nice. I was there for some time.
Yeah. One thing I just want to say too is like an intersection, like one of the things I've been really moved, Hannah, by the way that you write about distance and the different kinds of distances and mediation that structure the analytic scene or the therapeutic encounter. And as we're looking at these things, I'm thinking about, because one of the, it's sort of outside the purview of this conversation, but one of the big spaces in the show is gynecology, which actually has its own choreography of looks and looking. Terry Capsalis, I think is the name of the woman who wrote the book Public Privates, which is, has an incredible writing about the choreography around the gynecological, the pelvic exam. In the kind of classic version of that, the patient is on a table with the legs up and in stirrups, and then white, like a cloth is draped over the legs up to the knees, and just maybe over the knees, creating what now has talked about in relationship to other works in this series of hers as a kind of proscenium theater, right? And where you have, in essence, a doctor kind of looking between the legs, and it's like its little stage, and but one of the things that draping does is it prevents the patient from making eye contact with the doctor when the doctor is working in between your legs. And so in the kind of horrific stories of the sexual abuse of patients during pelvic exams, that draping has been actually a tool that's used to basically alienate the patient. And then the way that I hadn't thought about how this kind of classical position and that kind of psychoanalytic relation in which the patient isn't, the client isn't looking at the analyst, is actually also mirroring that, right? Because with that particular version of the pelvic exam, what happens is you're talking about the body, like the doctor is talking about the body, and the patient is like on the table and looking out at space, and no one's looking at each other, and you're talking about the body as if it's not yours, right? That there's all these scenes of alienation that kind of bounce around in that. So, but yet at the same time, I'm like, do you want to lock eyes with your doctor when they're actually like putting the speculum in? I don't know. Maybe not everybody's cup of tea. So this choreographing of looks, like as we're looking at each other, and distancing is so important. And yeah, so anyway, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about like what what distance means to you, right? Like what distance means to you in your work and what that word does for you in your writing about psychoanalysis.
Thank you. I mean, I just lost my protective distance, but I'm going to roll with it. I mean, one thing that's interesting is it's no accident you just had that free association, or like at least, right, psychoanalysis, theory of overdetermination, at least one reason is because the couch comes from the same place. Right, so Charcot's couch, which Freud adopted and didn't get rid of, was there for gynecological massage, as well as the fainting of the hysteric woman. Freud doesn't get rid of it because he realizes it does something great for him, which is that he doesn't have to look at his patients. Because actually it's exhausting. It was one of the things that was really shocking to analysts when they moved on to Zoom, and if there are analysts in the room, you can speak for yourselves. Also different for patients is that constant demand to look, and same for teaching. It really does something. So I tried to think, the distance cure I worked on as my dissertation book, I'd worked on it long before the COVID-19 pandemic. But in trying to think about that kind of final instantiation of distance, part of it is the demand, right, that's made by certain kinds of media. I started that book also out of an interest in what is pure in psychoanalysis and what isn't. in its history. We have been told, I'm very interested in the received histories of psychoanalysis, a field that is weirdly not interested in its history. Artists that I know tend to be very interested in the history of art. Doctors actually fascinated by medical history. Psychoanalysts are like, please shut up. And that's because there's actually a really long radical history we could recuperate. And it doesn't start recently, and it doesn't even start at mid-century. It's right there from the beginning. So I was interested in the supposed purity of Freud's encounter that looks like that. Ooh, Freud's on the screen. That's like magic. That's Freud's couch that he only practiced with and on for like 6 months before he died. It's not the couch he died on. I've seen that couch. They keep it locked up. But it turns out, no. There are all these innovations around how to use media as just one example of what a Protestant might call like an intercessor in the treatment. Another one is money, right? Money is a medium. And it turns out there's a long history of getting rid of money, or the idea that it's dyadic rather than group, or self-analysis, or all these different permutations. There is a really rich history that remains, super needs to be uncovered. And so I use tele, the idea of distance, to get at that, especially because it's often radical, which we wouldn't know from the COVID-19 pandemic.
What do you mean by radical?
The people who are interested in teletherapy were often trying to think about questions of access. They were also interested in questions of protective distance. I made the joke about the flowers, but thinking about boundary violation. They were interested in all the different ways you could convene help during war. So in my book, I talk about Fanon and the revolution in Algeria and the use of the radio and his understandings of the radio as a therapeutic medium, but also like Winnicott and Klein in World War II. War comes up a lot. Also with queer intimacy and meeting and gathering, but not physically together as being really important. So often the people who are drawn to tele, again, not in the COVID-19 pandemic, when people, who are very interested in startups and profit got interested in tele, but in its longer history have often been on the side of kind of radicalizing what's called the frame in psychoanalysis, like the couch, the hour, the money, the fee, that's all together the frame.
I mean, I think the distance thing, as you were talking, I was thinking about like the paper bag that your porn magazine or your like whatever comes in, it's like a protective thing.
Yeah.
It's a little bit, there's like an aspect of shame that's kind of associated with it, but it's also a shield. One of the weird things that happens that you like don't get access to anymore when you move to that Zoom kind of interface is the like armature that we see in Eisenman's painting, for example. But then all of a sudden, our doctor, our person, has access to our space, and that's something that like we get to leave behind when we enter their space. Even though their space is kind of a theater that's been prepared for us. All of a sudden, like they are looking into this other element that they didn't have access to, before. And that kind of question of like vulnerability and being seen and like is weird.
Absolutely. And so one thing that when I started the project I was really interested in was the idea that tele equals loss. There's just less there. It's less good. And then you could make a pretty conservative argument that would be like, and that's why it's been given to people who traditionally can't access the consulting room that looks like Freud's. And that was, again, the kind of militant understanding from, I'm saying militant, but they were really serious about it, from psychoanalysts. Like they would say to me, mainstream US psychoanalysts, they would say to me, you can't imagine Freud's Zoom room. And I'd be like, oh yeah? Freud did so much teletherapy. But part of that is like, I think, again, trying to show, okay, so yes, you get this added bonus, is it good? Like seeing inside the patient's room. And I talked to so many analysts. There was very little critical work on teletherapy going into the pandemic, which meant I spent a lot of time talking to analysts in a kind of pseudo supervisory, which is weird, but capacity, like what is a telepractice? What might be some things to consider? And they would all tell me these stories of like the patient who takes the call, not just in bed, You know, I write from bed. I do everything in bed on my computer. But in states of undress, what does it communicate? Or the patient who would stand looming over the Zoom. And you're like, well, that's a communication. Or a patient, another example is a patient who started the treatment in the pandemic for pandemic, you know, anxiety, depression, so say we all, at a minimum. And then it turned out the patient had, in the course of the treatment, gotten pregnant and had a baby and never mentioned it. But again, you wouldn't know. So this is, right, this whole array of new kinds of communication. So yes, had it been a quote unquote embodied, I hate this, the in-person scenario, yeah, you might have known that your patient was pregnant, but you would never know, they wouldn't tell you. Yeah. And, you know, trying to change that footing to be like, well, okay, this is really rich. And yet we're calling it, you know, tinny or like flat. I'm like, is it really? And also I hate Zoom too. You know, like both things are true. I hate it so much.
Yeah, we get access to a whole other kind of range of communications. I know a therapist whose patient like had a session while taking a shit on Zoom and like
The
didn't hide
patient?
it. Yeah,
Or
and
the
didn't hide
analyst?
it at all
Okay.
to the
You
therapist.
gotta check.
Isn't that amazing?
I love people.
Maybe you'll do like a retraining, you know, and then you can.
We should talk about Schreiber.
Yeah, we should talk about Schreiber. So sorry, I keep going over there, and I don't.
Is that okay?
And I don't have my glasses on when it happens, and so I don't know what that's showing you. Sorry, hold on.
Yeah, let's talk about Schreiber, and then let's
Yeah.
talk to each other.
Yeah, so Daniel Schreiber is a figure at the heart of El Palomar's two-channel installation in what is normally the project room, and which has been folded into this exhibition. And I have to say, it's one of the difficult moments around this show for me is like when we've had things that were in the installation zone, they've had to be kind of like pulled back a little bit to be in the room with so much other work. And in other iterations of this, the entryway is like, Schreiber is a woman. Like the title of it is in huge letters that you see, like it's a thing that you must pass through it before you go into the space. And we kind of dialed that down for lots of different reasons. But it's a declarative, you know, it's a declarative work that turns to the historical figure of Daniel Schreiber, who wrote one of the most important patient memoirs in the history of medicine, Memoirs of My Nervous Illness. And this is a text that Schreiber wrote in order to liberate herself from an asylum. And so I'm using she, her pronouns, which is to go to this quote, something I'm doing from the here and now, and following and honoring El Palomar's work. Then this memoir is like, and I'll be frank, this is a text I knew as a queer theorist because it gets written a lot by Freud and other, there's lots of writing in psychoanalytic theory, some of which is super homophobic, almost all of which I'd say is like transphobic or just has this transphobic and has a phenomenal earth-sized blind spot in it, which means that you can't see what's totally obvious, which is, that Schreiber is in a dream space that is more real than the world that Schreiber is in which Schreiber is transformed into a woman, and that this transformation is furthermore a site of enormous pleasure. And the whole memoir is kind of like about bringing you to an understanding of what that story is about and what it means. And this has all been kind of churned through a kind of machine of, in terms of, especially in Freud's writing, of these kind of formulas about gender, sexuality, desire, and identification, which turn any kind of paranoid fantasy into a story about a repressed homosexuality. And there's so much more to say about Schreiber. Schreiber's memoir appears in the opening paragraphs of Deleuze and Guattari's Thousand Plateaus. A lot of the most imaginative writing in that space of French philosophical and critical writing is it's like activated by or electrified by images and language that's drawn right out of Schreiber's writing. It's a hugely influential text, but when I saw this, I was gobsmacked because I had never seen Schreiber treated as a trans, non-binary, trans trans woman, like just kind of like moves you through these different spaces, which are all spaces that are literally created for you by Schreber's language, and it's Schreber's language that actually provides the text of this work. So it was one of those things where you realize like this memoir has been waiting for El Palomar and waiting for, you know, the people who are my students, right? I speak as somebody who's nearly 60, waiting for people who have a very different understanding of gender, sexuality, and possibility. Anyway, so yeah, I'll stop
Show
there.
some of the other images.
Yeah.
I think just to kind of get quickly, Hannah,
Yeah.
to how you sort of started, they're really, it troubles this idea that there's any recovery work to do, because it is kind of present for us and waiting for that different sort of interpretive listening.
Yeah.
And also just two of the intertitles, which, you know, are right there, are, you know, they're back to back, because I think it also, you know, the Schreber story is, first there is this incredible memoir, and it's like this big. My graduate students really hated me when I tried to get them to read the whole thing in 1 week, and I was also like, you must. It needs to, you know, it's really impossible to excerpt. It's so powerful down to the syntactical level, and then also immediately taken up, right, in all of these ways. There are all these case studies, right, people trying to sort of come back in and rewrite, agreeing with everything that Jennifer said. And then it's also, one thing that's so painful about this film is also this kind of almost jump cut between Schreber in her really, because it's designed by this artist collective, incredibly physically, aesthetically beautiful straitjacket, and then free, some kind of freedom, right? It's never really named. And so two of the intertitles are, the first is, all, at this very moment, I have all the diseases ever existed. And then the very next intertitle is, I am trapped in every state institution. And right, the way you get a disease is by being in an institution, right? The disease doesn't exist as such until it is named as such. And the story of Schreber across 100 years, which is the story, I think, of this film, is to have a sort of disease iterated over and over and over again, and insisting, just again, playing with what you said, Jennifer, that there is an illness, right? Yeah. Because to foreclose the idea of illness and to give on to thinking about experience would be just too threatening, right? That's the breakdown in psychoanalysis that it's so afraid of.
I've gone back to this work.
Yeah, there you go.
Right. Yeah, because it's like, it's only through the diagnosis of the illness that one can get the health insurance that allows you to get the care. Like, it's just like this, yeah, you get it anyway.
For so many people, and then especially in terms of trans healthcare in the US and in the UK and elsewhere. Different systems, but so it is.
Do we want to open the floor up? Yeah. So we invite questions, but thoughts also, you know, reactions. Yeah. I wait for the microphone to come to you. That's Karen.
I have a question mostly about the patient and analyst experience. Is the patient asked to dissociate from themselves and to acquire some kind of an objectivity? And is objectivity a male virtue? And is subjectivity in that context considered to be effeminate?
So,
Freudian psychoanalysis. I have no idea. I just had the question.
Yeah, no, it's a beautiful question. I mean, the problem is, and I write about this a lot, is we don't exactly know what's happening between any analytic dyad, right? And so much takes place in that not knowing. Theoretically, the patient is asked, the fundamental rule of Freudian psychoanalysis is to say whatever comes to mind. So if that thought is dissociated, then that will be what comes to mind, and if it isn't, it isn't. Patients in general are not asked to be objective about themselves as a kind of first order wish, but that doesn't mean that that's not eventually the kind of, get logical, right? Doesn't ever happen. But that's something I love about psychoanalysis in principle and theory, is that it's not about advice. It's not about coming outside of the self to look at the self. It's very much about, which is demanded of us all the time under capital, right? It's precisely that opposite motion. And then different psychoanalytic schools are so different from one another about what that looks like or how that's engaged. But the couch, the not looking, is supposed to free up the analyst to not look back, totally, but also the patient to feel free to free associate. And many people feel it's essential, that lying down, that supine position, which is also a very vulnerabilizing position in multiple ways. I don't know if you want to add.
Could you say something a little bit? One of the things I know that you've written about is or observed, right, is like the feminization of the profession itself. And I was a little surprised by some of the numbers around that. Could you talk about that?
Sure, totally. Because I think what's also in your question is like who is supposedly doing the listening would be a kind of masculine objectivity, like listening with, Freud calls it even hovering listening. He's thinking about it like a telephone call. Of course, that's not how telephone calls work. Freud was a terrible student of technology and hated it. Now, psychoanalysis in the United States, like all of the Psy fields, PSY fields, are by and large extraordinarily feminized. I mean that two ways. The first is the way we mean it in the academy around labor in general. So service with a smile is the classic hallmark of feminization. Doesn't have to mean that you are a woman to do that work. The second is by gender. So the numbers they're really intense. The graduating social work classes, upwards of 90%, 95% women. PsyD now, upwards of 95% women. PhD in psychology, these are all the different ways, right? 92%. And that has happened recursively in the United States, where women have been kicked out of the field, brought back into the field, kicked out, brought back in. But the flyover date, so-called, of when the fields, that group of fields surpassed 50% women, were in the 70s. Whereas medical school, that hasn't happened at all. And then we can talk about race and class. And what is the knock-on effect of that? Many things. One is that psychoanalysis in the US up through the late 1980s, early 1990s, you had to have a medical degree to practice, by and large. There were some rare exceptions. So women did lawsuits, et cetera, to gain access to the field of psychoanalysis at the sort of tail end of the second wave. After, being in women's health collectives, doing consciousness raising groups, et cetera, then fought for access to become analysts. But that is very recent. We've had like a generation in the US. That's not true anywhere else in the world. And that's really torqued the kind of Nicole, that imaginary of, is that my father or is it Sigmund Freud? I mean, that's why the New Yorker cartoons, I mean, they're not beautiful like this, right? But give us that example.
Question in the back?
I had a question could I respond to that in terms of just like as a practitioner of psychoanalysis, is that the field has actually also moved to this like, and I'm sure you know this, but to this like it's moving in a relational direction where sort of the analyst or the psychoanalytic practitioner's subjectivity is really taken into account a lot more as far as what's brought up in the patient. Sometimes there's a dialogue about the relationship. So it's less of this like kind of like purely objective field now. And then my question for you, because you seem to have just like an incredible plethora of knowledge around all of this, and you mentioned in regards to the history, the way that psychoanalysts have wanted to do away with money. And I would love to hear you just like expand on that. I'm really curious.
Yeah, sure. I'll just go back to the comment first, which is to say that instead of objectivity in the US, there's this fantasy of neutrality, right? Which is that the analyst's subjectivity, it doesn't matter who you are. The patient, it kind of also doesn't matter who you are. And in part, that's because psychoanalysis in the US has been practiced by white men, often for white women, right? This is thank God in every way, no longer the case. But it's not just, I just want to say, it's not just like, oh, the fields are going in this relational direction. This is a cataclysmic fight, knockdown, drag out fight. My stepfather was doxxed for suggesting that like, there's a kind of parasitic whiteness in psychoanalysis. So yes, and like because it's like the kicking and screaming. last gasp. Yeah, there's a whole radical history starting with Sigmund Freud. Great book recommendation, Elizabeth Danto's Freud's Free Clinics. That shows that there were 29 free clinics for psychoanalysis in whatever, 7 or 8 different countries up through Nazification. They were lost. They were lost because psychoanalysis was understood by the Nazis to be a Jewish science. As that got self-internalized, there was an idea like, let's not also be the communist Jewish science, right? Let's close some stuff down. And that had many knock-on effects, including psychoanalysis and its colonial history in Palestine would be one of them. The other would be the destruction of a kind of, free psychoanalysis for all. One that, along with getting rid of money, was also really interested in experimenting with the frame. Like, what if we brought back hypnosis was a question, right? What if it was short-term? What if it was on demand? What if it wasn't 6 times a week? What if? Psychoanalysis in the US from 45 until present has largely, not entirely, lost its subjunctive quest. There's no what if. We know how it goes. It's 4 times a week, right? We know what it costs. We know it costs more here and more in New York. We were just talking about this, the on-demand, right? And that's what it's gonna be like. And I think there is a major return to the subjunctive at the heart of psychoanalysis.
By that you mean the what if?
The what if? What if we do it like this? There are many other examples between Freud's free clinics and now. My beautiful, wonderful colleague Kevin Dong writes about Wortham's clinic, the Lafargue Clinic in Harlem. It's beautiful. I'm like, how many parapraxis essays can I plug? But he has a great essay in parapraxis called Broke Psychoanalysis, on and on and on, right? Tosqueus, who's really having a moment, also sought to get rid of the fee, but keep the institution, interestingly. We can think about that. There's so many. And mostly psychoanalysis is like, please don't talk about that because the subjunctive is really bad for neutrality. It's really bad for the kind of mainstays of the US version and field.
There's a question here.
Hi, I had a question about this idea of throwing the baby and or the daddy out with the bathwater. And I was wondering if we might be able to disaggregate a bit like what the science of listening does. And I guess specifically I'm thinking about, well, maybe we decide that the science of listening is very good for kind of critical or cultural analysis and we hold on to it in the academy, but we decide that maybe listening isn't the path to healing and do away with it in the clinic. So I guess I'm just wondering about maybe subjunctives or conditionalities in this question of where we throw psychoanalysis away versus where we might hold on to it. Or if maybe these settings do all kind of have to coexist. We keep it everywhere, we get rid of it everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think these are all amazing questions. Am I on the side? I have to check, but it works. It doesn't work for everyone. And most people are, given capitalism, given the way it's set up, not gonna get to experience it. It's expensive and it takes goddamn forever, right? This is not, and it is brutal. It's really hard work. I don't even know what I mean by that except to say it's really hard work to be an analytic patient. And it's rife with the possibility of failure after all that investment, whether it's economic, temporal, or both, and ripe for abuse and ripe for just not a good match, but you spent 2.5 years figuring that out, right? And there's so much that happens in that closed room, which makes it so hard to tell. Is it transference? Or is my analyst absolutely the wrong person for me / abusive, et cetera? I don't think you have to keep it in the academy to keep it in the clinic, but I think things have tended to go really much better when there is that interplay. You've brought up Guattari alongside, right? Guattari hid out in Tosqueus' Saint-Alban to resist going to Algeria to fight for France. And he learned a lot there, right? And that was good for the writing. I mean, so I think there are not millions probably, but dozens and dozens of examples of that interplay. But it doesn't mean anyone else has to do it. The other way to put this cheekily is that psychoanalysis in the US is almost already gotten rid of. So whatever pace this return to Freud, there are 3,200 analytic patients in the United States right now, and like a bunch of you are in this audience, and I feel like I know half of them. And that's really few people. I think, again, it's very few. That doesn't mean psychotherapy. I see, I'm already making up in my mind, that the two of you are analysts. I'm like, don't worry. There are lots of people who went twice a week, all right? But the standards of what an analysis is. And so in that way, we might get the swish anyway. It might not be in the US for that much longer.
See, Rosie.
I'm going to be so.
Thank you. First off, this has been delicious. It's just, I'm savoring this. Thank you for this. I am a therapist. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, so I am not an analyst. I was exposed to it. I just want to say really quick, a few years ago, my husband and I went to Vienna. He went to this awesome gay dance, and I went to fucking Freud's studio. I went fucking to Freud. Thank you for this. I think I need 8 more years on my analyst's couch to just explore that. What was that about? So my question is this. I see Freud as like petrol, like it's dying. We have to kill it before it kills us. And I was wondering, it's, tied to capital, people are going to fight it because there's so much money in Freud. And I was wondering if you had the same concept around this, and if not, what do you see as the sunset? Not necessarily the replacement, but the sunset of of Freud.
Want me to go again? Thank you, and I'm sorry, that you did that. On the other hand, they have a really good gift shop there. My favorite, for real, they sell a sponge that says the word neurosis on it with the green Brillo that you can use to scrub yourself. If you're my friend, you may have received one. I don't think of Freud like petrol, though I really appreciate the metaphor. I think that there's so much there in that standard edition. I know I was told not to do that with the mic, and there's a lot that people don't read or don't need to read. But it depends on who's reading it with you or how we're reading it, totally. And so, John Forrester, I promised you I was going to say this. John Forrester, my favorite historian of psychoanalysis, says the process of teaching Freud or reading Freud is always to unlearn him first. There's so much Freud we have to get rid of to have Freud again. And anyway, he also goes on to say, basically, you can't get rid of Freud. He's already inside us. If we go to the bar and we do a little overhearing, the way people talk about their relationships, the way they talk about their own ambitions, their own pains are so saturated with a Freud. I think for me, and I'm certainly not going to be able to kill the Freud inside because of my upbringing and now my professional life, although second act. But instead it's what Freud do we want? So let's go get him. Let's go make him. And we can therefore sunset the petrol Freud. And then I'm how to complete the metaphor? Renewable energy, the kind of, what are they? The solar panel Freud, or whatever the next sequence would be. And the thing that's really wonderful is people have been doing that for 100 years. So we don't have to do it alone, even historically. And there's so many people doing it right now. So that would be my answer to that. But I'm also really sympathetic to the idea of just be done, and what else is next. I totally am.
I want to say, just speaking more as a literary critic, or that from that part of myself, a figure like Freud is it's a problem in the same way that the canon is a problem, and when you engage it, you reinforce the kind of dominance of the canon, in your field. And one way in which I've been rewiring my understanding of Freud is by looking at the figures in his writing and rethinking them from a different perspective, right? Or just kind of reading. I'm not reading Freud against the grain, really. It's more I'm thinking about this work I did with one case where a woman had what he was reading as a paranoid fantasy, and I was like, well, what if I take her fear and anxiety as actually totally reasonable? And then how, like who is she and what is she worried about, and were her worries like appropriate for that time, right? So it's about kind of coming back into a Freud text, but looking at figures in Freud, rather than the father, kind of constantly, drawing this kind of father figure back into my work, which is what I found really liberating about El Palomar, right? And the way in which they approach Daniel Schreiber and it's like recovery and repair and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, something we've been talking about with Schreiber is that, if you were a, gender non-conforming, trans, whatever language we might use to kind of like put back on a person, why wouldn't you go to the cosmos to sort of imagine your freedom or your like ability to live? And there have been so many other instances of like trans organizers. We talked about this the other day, like Angela Douglas from the Transsexual Action Organization, who in the 1970s like gathered trans people together to try to levitate police cars. I mean, like why wouldn't another planet? And thinking about, I mean that, yeah. There's lots of questions over here.
Maybe we could stack questions. Take maybe just start with 2 and see what happens.
I have kind of the opposite question from you. So I'm wondering if Hannah, you or any of you can talk about the relationship between the left and psychoanalysis right now. Why the left might need psychoanalysis. Of course, we've talked a bit about why psychoanalysis needs the interventions. And Hannah, I'm interested in your reference to these radical histories of psychoanalysis that we spent a lot of our time critiquing Freud, but also we have all of these histories that arose alongside Freud, all of these experimental clinics. You've mentioned Tusquets, for example, who was the anarchist, I don't know if he called himself a psychoanalyst, but who ran San Alban during the Spanish Civil War. And when you said, that made this reference to the kind of feminist consciousness-raising groups, Tusquets has this quote that's like, the proletariat must always be devoted to the unconscious, and so the proletariat needs unconsciousness-raising groups. And I'm kind of referencing the parapraxis dossier on Tusquets here, so wondering if you can speak a little bit more to that, in particular to thinking about how Tusquets' intervention was rather than the dyadic relationship maybe between the psychoanalyst and the analysand to cure the patient, was rather that the patients can somehow have some sort of like constellatory transference that can then actually cure the institution, right, or cure the psych ward. And there was this sort of inversion of where the cure needed to happen, rather, like this is maybe, we could see Juliet Mitchell's hysterics rising up against the law of the father. So yeah, I'm wondering if you can elaborate a little bit more about that, or even just thinking about this show and like why the subjects that have historically found psychoanalysis maybe oppressive, actually there's this moment where it is something in psychoanalysis, there's some sort of liberatory impulse in the science.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, there's so much there. I mean, the first thing that should be said is, again, to disambiguate, like, there is no homogeny in psychoanalysis, right? Back to this, to bring the two questions together, like, one person's Freud is decidedly not another person's Freud. I am of the opinion that the US post-war, we got the worst Freud, for sure, and the most violent Freud, and the Freud that has been used to harm the most people. And it's really a US. I'm like already like, and with 2 other immediate examples come to mind. But truly the US, it's up there. It's really up there. The other is Palestine, and thinking about Israeli psychoanalysis, which, I recommend Lara Shiha's book on that, Psychoanalysis Under Occupation. Why does the left need psychoanalysis? This is a real question. When we've debated, like, oh, we're told there's a return to Freud. Great for the magazine, but why? Like, let's get into it. And it is on the left. I think one has to do with defeat, right? Kind of stock taking. The defeats of the last 20 years, 30 years is one. I think also there's so much death. So much death. And it's been basically foreclosed and remaindered. And I think that actually kind of psychoanalysis it can be good for thinking that. These are not going to be happy answers. But to go to Tusquets, the other thing has to do with, he would be like, okay, a group of patients can cure each other, and then they can cure an institution, and the end goal was to cure society. That kind of working together in a kind of group transference would be itself revolutionary. And that you can run, the reason he was not anti-institution, it's very hard to sit with that in watching the Schreiber film. The reason he wasn't against the institution is he believed you could make an institution that would do so many things for so many people, including protect and save dissidents, right? Including protect and save artists, and that you can open up the institution so that you can destroy the categories of insanity and sanity, and in fact, take care of everyone. He called it taking care of the network. And that sounds really good. It sounds really good right now. I think it sounded really good then. I think that's part of why there's this kind of turn, is like, what if we could do something like that?
Can I jump in here?
Yeah,
because coming at this from a related, like a related angle, right? Which is, like why? Because I mean, there's a broad turn to psychoanalysis, not just Freud, and also to group dynamics. That's also in contemporary art, and there's a wide range of artists who are working with groups and group dynamics in performance, and so I'll say around the institution, right, in the left, and speaking from an academic point of view, and I'm going to speak kind of frankly. Boy, oh boy, does that sound like daddy issues when you're at work, right? When you've got like free-floating, clear hostility towards the upper administration and invoking the university as this inherently toxic structure. And boy, oh boy, speaking as somebody who was on a front line for a pretty awful sexual abuse case in my department, was that discourse ever weaponized in order to drive huge distances between people at work and coworkers, making it really impossible for us to have honest conversations about what we are witnessing around each other. And this kind of like really super Oedipalized like hatred of the institution, it feels super primal, right? It feels like psychological in a really deep way, meaning it's like holding our relationships to our work and our lives, and it's very high stakes, and it's really hard to confront and unravel. And people are feeling it, right? Like there's so much brutality that's happening in and around and through our institutions. And sometimes, I don't know, there's like I've been in environments in which I've witnessed what felt like a translation of the violence we were witnessing on a horizontal level amongst ourselves into a story about the father and this kind of like downward pressing, like oppressive kind of thing coming from above. I don't want to discount the ways in which the institution is also an instrument of violence, right? But that it's like when we are subjects to the institution, how do we transform our relationships to each other within that space, right? And so anyways, Toscaeus has helped me to understand some of that, partly because it's Toscaeus and then other people who do work with groups, right, and psychotics, right? Because like from that kind of Freudian transference story where all the work happens between the analysand and the analyst, because you're transferring these attachments and stories onto each other. Some felt that people who were suffering from psychotic delusions like Schreiber were untreatable because the nature of the delusion made transference in that model impossible. And so some of these folks who are working in these group dynamics and working with like veterans and people who are suffering really deep trauma observe and argue that the transference that's happening is just not individuated, right? That it's social, right? That it's the structure of the hospital. So it's like, if the hospital is being cured, it's partly because the hospital is this site of this kind of transferential work, right? That for Toscaeus and others is the way you work with, especially people who are sort of working in that kind of schizo, delusional and psychotic kind of end of the spectrum. Now, on an autobiographical level, I have an investment in that narrative because I was stalked by somebody who suffered from psychotic delusions, and it was a student of mine. And when I was really in the middle of it, you realize like, this story isn't about me. It's about, I'm a teacher, they're a student, and we are in an institution. And the thing that was happening between us was a delusion, but it was also a sickness, and it was a sickness that was manifesting a lot of what was the kind of toxic potentials of the dynamics that organize our relationship to each other. So anyway, sorry, I was kind of like going off on that, but yeah.
No, for sure. And I think that pursuant to that, just to get back to and the left, I think it's also, we've seen this time and time again in organizing of the last year, right? If only we could get everyone to do group relations work. And there's no time for that yet, right?
Don't you think the students are trying to cure the university?
I think
right?
that's also true.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's a really beautiful parallel.
Yeah. Stack, but that was such a juicy question.
Yeah, it's great, Rosie. Thank you.
I don't know how stackable it was, but this actually goes, this is less a question and more like three thoughts having a collision in my brain, so I apologize. But you talk about the historically white men treating historically white women, and then the feminization of the field idea, and then the sort of insistent refusal of history among American psychoanalysis. And that brought me to this Venn diagram of then the sort of Zionist thread of American psychoanalysis and the willful refusal, and then the transphobic vein of American psychoanalysis, and just this whole constellation around this determined refusal of history, and then the violence and aggression that gets sort of recapitulated in that. And so it's not a question, it's just a collection of difficult thoughts that I wonder if we want to do something with. And we've already kind of done some of that, so that's just what's coming up for me.
Yeah, I mean, I want to do something with that. I mean, that. I feel like that's what I'm giving my life to. I mean, there's just no question. Yes to everything you said, and thank you for also inviting us into how you got that. I mean, just this morning I spent an hour reading through. Maybe some of you did too. 70 exchanges all of a sudden in my inbox from one of my professional listservs that are escalating and doing what psychoanalysts do best when they want to get rid of someone, which is call them insane, which is like the #1 epithet, in this case psychotic, about Israel-Palestine, right? Let's just be their phrasing. Why? Because someone posted links to a podcast on October 7th. And then boom, from there, it's been, 3 days now. That kind of immediacy of that fight is so present. It's why, though I agree with everything you said, I want to pause and mark that it is such a fight, right? How, who, where. I mean, to go back to the science of listening, who can listen, how they listen, who's worth listening to, who can treat. These huge questions still in the field. And in ways that are terrifying. I'm working on an essay right now. I was on deadline, and a friend read it, which was so lovely of them to do for me. And they were like, but can you say this or that? I'm like, no, honey, that's just how so behind mainstream psychoanalysis appears to, say, an academic, when you really get into the intra discussions around race, class, gender, sexuality, and on and on and on. And it's incredibly painful. But this year, as with many other moments, Palestine has been where it's really shown at a max, and their intersections and their interrelations.
Caroline?
Can you just say more about that? Because I don't, you had mentioned how psychoanalysis was a Jewish science and the history of that, and how it affects psychoanalysis in Israel and Palestine and how it's practiced today. I don't know any of that history, and
Sure.
I just love to hear.
Sure, of course. So I want to put some distance on the idea of the Jewish science. So that's the Nazification term, right? So it's in quotes. But it gets taken up like descriptively. And that's why I flag it and I bring it up, because that is the Nazi term for psychoanalysis, is the Jewish science. And again, and then from there, Jewish analysts were like, but we don't also want to be the queer communist, right? So let's hive off the militant wing. And that's what happened. So part of that story is that, without trying to be too inside baseball, in Central Europe in psychoanalysis, in let's say the first and second generation, there were two power centers. London slowly coming online as a third, maybe, which is Vienna. We know that, right? Sorry again. I'm like, and like, can we go dancing now to make up for it? The other, Berlin. And both had free clinics. So Elizabeth Danto's book is really good on this. It's an amazing book. The Vienna clinic didn't have a patron, right? It was done peer-to-peer. So like, I'll see your patient. If you see my patient, we make a voucher system, and we can do it right now. In Berlin, they did have a patron. And arguably, you can call this not a free clinic. You can call it something else. That patron was a very, very wealthy fur trader air. You know, he didn't trade first. He was an analyst. And the Berlin clinic was the first in the world to offer analytic training for a very long time, you know, and you can see these beautiful graphs. Everyone who trained there who wasn't trained by Freud. And Freud tried to only train US analysts, so they'd leave, right? Keeping that, because they just economically, they couldn't support it. That guy, Max Eichington in Berlin, who's kind of like Anna Freud's other dad, transferentially, in 1933, he closes down. He basically makes a devil's bargain in the clinic. We'll get to Palestine in 1 second. He makes the devil's bargain that, like, and don't you have the beautiful books here that are supposed to be the destroyed libraries, right? Yeah. We have this, really, you have to think, like, the burning of the books is happening. Chief among them, Freud's. Any book on sexuality, right? The destruction of sexology is happening, right? It's a very, so he makes a devil's bargain, and he says, keep the clinic open, but Aryanize it, right? Put a Nazified person in charge of it. And that's what happens. And then he leaves for Palestine. And so and he's a Zionist. And so the kind of colonial impulse of fine, close my clinic basically, Aryanize it, destroy it, remake it in the Nazi vision, but I'm gonna go wash the sins of Europe in this colonial activity happens immediately, 1933. Now, and then from there, right, and I really do recommend the Shiha book, we have a whole history of Israeli psychoanalysis as it partners with the IDF, as it takes up perversely Fanon and uses it to try and do war trauma and so on. But, and there's so much there, right? And I'm trying not to get too in the weeds, but it's a very, very important history. I want to say one other thing, though, which is that Freud was an anti-Zionist. Freud was called upon to ask upon, what do you want to do about psychoanalysis? Will you move to Palestine? And Freud was like, absolutely no, and has a beautiful letter. But he wasn't like, absolutely no, and don't take psychoanalysis to Palestine. Right? He was like, I'm really anti-Zionist. I don't believe in this project. I think it's horrible. But if you are going to have a Hebrew university, and right, so that's the other thing, right? Fine, make my science there too. And Daniel Gatzenbude also has a beautiful book called A People's History of Psychoanalysis, which talks about this kind of colonial impulse in Freud. Send it here, send it there. That's what he called it, his term, colonial, kind of impulse. I hope that.
You guys, could we go for like another 3 hours?
If someone brings me a beer.
Please. Okay, so I just wanted to scratch the surface of two types of skepticism. And one is, the more familiar one from Anti-Oedipus, right? So Deleuze and Guattari. And I feel like it reverberates in our experience because we know a lot of assholes that have a therapist and it seem to become even more insufferable as they continue.
Oh yeah,
right.
For real.
And so when I think of the Anti-Oedipus project, what resonates with me is the self-perpetuating mechanism of certain. I think of it as a diorama, but Deleuze and Guattari describe it as a family theater, right? Either or, it doesn't matter. So that's one sort of strain of skepticism that actually seems to have a pragmatic question for us today. What is, I mean, and, not to mention, of course, the pay grade and everything. When I think of insufferable behaviors, I used to, as a poor immigrant graduate student in New York City, think of therapy as on the same pedestal of invincibility and untouchability as brunch. And I was absolutely out of touch, out of my range back then in terms of budget and in terms, I worked 7 days a week for about 7 years without, a day off because I was trying to, make it in New York. So there's all of those, the self-perpetuating mechanism question I'm curious about. But then another thing which brings us closer to where we are right now is you guys have curated an amazing exhibition, and I will keep coming, and I think it's historic. Something that resonates with me is that art actually has a big part in the story. Even the literary art of Freud himself, right? Because there's certain texting of his that we read as literature. And so, but also what Jennifer was saying, I feel like Schreber was liberated in that room, as far as I'm concerned, an hour and a half ago when I watched that, because I finally sat and watched it. And that liberation seems to have a promise that therapy itself doesn't seem to have. And it's also, on the subject of listening specifically, how kids these days, would say, I feel seen. I actually feel like that video was listening to me. Right? So, the science of listening has been transmogrified in a way, right? And art does this and has been doing this, right? So it's sort of like two reasons to throw therapy in the trash.
I mean, yeah. And again, as I said, right, it may already be. Also, is brunch less cool yet? I'm like, if we get rid of brunch, I will join you, right? Like it's a twofer. Not in the academy, in the clinic. It's like brunch and therapy. Like I'm loving this. Yes, art's been doing it. Schreber did it for herself. She had to, right? And there's so much to say about Schreber's own life history and her father who is in part responsible, according to many people, for Nazification. A father that bad, right? There's so much happening in the Schreber case. Like, please go read it. It's so beautiful, her book. So yes, yes to the power of art. Also yes to the annoying friend who is now therapized and even more whatever. But also, okay. But is therapy meant to take the place of liberation? I think this is an amazing open question, right? What can happen in the consulting room or the free clinic or the group? And is it a proxy for liberation? I think it brings us back to Rosie's question too, right? Which is the question of what does the left get from psychoanalysis? And I don't think that the left is trying to, the people who are on the side of liberation, are trying to use the consulting room to do the work of revolution, right? But at the same time, I think, I don't know, I keep going back to Lara Shiha's book, co-written with Stephen Shiha, the cases they detail there about the psychoanalysis that's happening in the West Bank and in Gaza. There can be a revolutionary praxis. It is not, in my opinion, largely happening in the places where we're thinking about brunch, right? And there's so much more to say there too.
I really love what you just said. I'm just absorbing that, but I just wanted to say that there's a lot of work out there, meaning artwork. I'm looking at Carmen, that does that, right? That works on you, and where you may feel seen, but you may feel seen in a way that you don't yet have words for, right? And so you leave slightly shifted and changed. And two, I wanted to say, you were talking about that self as the self-perpetuating kind of machine problem. Jeanne, I'm thinking about some of the work that you've brought into this show through our conversations, like Nikki Green's work, right? There's the self that's leaking, right? That pours itself out, right? That shows that to you, right? That's another version of a self that teaches you something, and that I think what people may feel seen/heard, or find themselves in the sound of that drip. Anyway, sorry, I just wanted to riff off of that a little bit because it was a really beautiful language. Yeah.
I think we have to stop, but only to go get beer.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you,
so
Hannah.
much for the show.